So thank you guys for coming. All my life I've wanted to be Charlie Rose, and now for 45 minutes I get to be. So I'm very excited. So before I start talking to these wonderful women about our show, I just sort of wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about how this show came to be. So for me, because it's a very personal show, and when I was really young, like 8 years old, I started writing to Bette Davis. I wrote to two famous people in my life, Bette Davis and the guy that played Horshack on Welcome Back, Kotter. And Bette Davis wrote me back. So what happened was, when I got the script, this was pre-American Horror Story. I had never talked to Jessica Lange ever in my life. I talked to Jessica Lange, and then I had a momentous meeting with Susan at the Mercer Hotel, and that's how I met Susan for the first time. And of course I loved her and continue to love her. I think she's a very incredible actress and an important cultural figure. So I sat down with her, yes. And you know, my career at that point was kind of just kicking into gear, and so I felt very honored that Susan would meet with me. And I sat down, and the first thing out of her mouth after "Hi, nice to meet you" was, "Why do people keep offering me Bette Davis in my career?" And it turns out that I was the fifth or fourth person, I think, to go to Susan and ask her to play Bette. So Susan, let's talk about that.
Well, I want to know if Horshack had answered you.
Probably.
Where would we be?
But the funny thing was, when I finally met and got to work with John Travolta, who had worked with Ron Paleo, I said, he never wrote me back. And John said, I'm so surprised by that. So then I thought, well, maybe my letter didn't get there. But it all turned out okay. So when I sat down with you for the first time, I remember you being wildly curious and like also kind of reticent. So can you talk about that? And why have people, obviously the physical resemblance is startling, but talk about your relationship with her.
Well, the first time that she got in touch with me was through a director that I'd worked with who was a friend of hers. This is when I was really a kid. And it was right after the book had come out that her daughter wrote, and she was devastated. And so she wanted to do a movie. And I said, great, but I had no wherewithal, and obviously my agents were lame because nothing happened, and I didn't know how to do it. And so that kind of disappeared. It would have been the early days, you know, and so I knew a little bit about her past because of that experience. And I was a fan. In fact, when I was doing Exit the King and I was really stuck, this was a Broadway show that I did a few years ago, I looked at her two Queen movies. Mm-hmm. Because I couldn't figure out, I won't go into it, but the way she walked was like a truck driver, you know. Mm-hmm. She was just, had this strange gait. And when I put on boots in that part instead of high heels, and I started doing that walk and sitting like, you know, this and everything, suddenly I had something that I could use for that Broadway show. So she kind of saved my ass on Exit the King. And so I knew her work, and she was so interesting because she was the first person, the first actress. There was one before her who OD'd, and then there was Bette, but who really became raw in an unattractive way when she did parts. She wasn't afraid. I mean, to be kind of unattractive, not only physically, but emotionally, you know, those early, and that's where she turned the corner. And so that was always kind of interesting to me, but I really didn't know that much about her. I just knew that every guy in drag did her really well. And I live in the Village, so I'd seen that. And so I knew that there was a perception of her that was very extreme. And this guy had said, don't worry, we're going to do it. It's not going to be camp, but I wasn't sure really in his world what that meant.
That's true.
You know, if you look at American Horror, you know, like everybody, the actors are always really good, and it's always well shot and everything. But of course, anyway, so of course I was afraid. I was afraid of doing. What I felt was that she needed to be she needed to exist for you guys in the moment. She couldn't be just something that you look and you go, oh, she kind of sounds like her, she kind of looks like her. That wasn't going to be enough. It had to somehow engage the audience for the first time almost, to see things that they didn't know, something that was more than, you know, all of these imitations that you'd seen. So that was really, really scary for me. I just didn't know how to bite into that. And her way of talking, my way of speaking is so sloppy and slow, and she had such a different way of emphasizing the weirdest words in every sentence, nothing that made sense. So I said to him, you know, I would need help. We got a great guy that you know, I've worked with before, and could we have Tim? Yes, you can have Tim. So then that wasn't a good enough excuse not to do it. So then I said, well, I'm just so afraid, you know, blah, 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 it's blah, 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 blah. And I remember so clearly, and then he waited till I'd just gone on, and then just said, well, I'm scared too, you know, I'm terrified too, we'll just do it. And we won't start until you're ready. We can do Jessica first or something. And I don't know why the idea that he was also terrified was very encouraging to me. You know, I don't know why that was the piece that had to fall in, but at that point I just thought, oh, what the f***, you know, let's just give it a whirl and get rid of her. She's been chasing me for so long. There must be a reason I'm supposed to do this.
So I want to start with Judy on this. So we found out we could actually shoot at the actual site of where they did the Academy Awards that year. And I remember being so thrilled. I'm like, yes, I really am so excited, because the actors can walk on the stage and we can recreate all that stuff and show people how it was really done. And we showed up, and I think my heart sank and Judy's heart sank, because 70% of it had been ripped out. It was all gone. And then somebody said, well, let's go find a place that looks like that. I was like, no. We're shooting here. I want Susan to stand where she stood. So Judy, talk about the recreation of that Oscar show and how hard you worked on it and what you found out about that time.
Well, it was the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, and we were lucky that the basic structure of the building was there, so we were able to use that as the basis for the exterior. And then inside, Ryan had planned this amazing Steadicam shot that goes from the stage itself through the backstage, all the rooms backstage, almost none of which were there,
right.
And which had to be recreated. And we went and looked at it, and then I started planning the green room and the press room and the journalist room and the photo op room and all of the rooms that you see very quickly as Joan Crawford walks through them. And I laid it out, and we made a model of it. I think the bathroom was what existed, the bathroom where you see the guy peeing in the urinal. And I laid it out and made this beautiful, you know, this model where you could see the path that she would walk through. And then we went to the backstage at the auditorium and taped it out with tape lines showing this is where the kitchen is and this is where the press room will be. And Ryan and Nelson, the cinematographer, and I went there and walked through it and timed it for the shot. And then we started, you know, doing mood boards and talking about the colors and doing all the research on what it really looked like at the time. What did the room where the press hung out and where they took the photographs and where the giant gold Oscars were. It was really fascinating to see what the Oscars looked like at that time. It was very different from now. The Academy wasn't well funded, so they did everything a little bit cheaply. And we were really true to that, not because we didn't have the money, but because we wanted to show it the way it was then. And it was a really beautiful mixture of glamour and kind of like, let's put on a show.
Lou, let's start talking in that episode about recreating the costumes for that specific episode. Specifically, let's start with talking about what Jessica wore as Joan Crawford, because she was a silver beaded dress. And it weighed how much?
A lot.
It weighed 50 pounds. Jessica Lange's back went out twice shooting that stuff. You know, it was like wearing armor. But everybody was a trooper about it. So, Lou, talk about recreating the clothes, and specifically that episode for this show.
And when we had dress folded. We carried it in this big Tupperware box, and I couldn't lift it and carry it. I had to have somebody else do it because it was so heavy. We wanted to have it hand beaded, but it would have cost 20 grand, and we did have a tight budget because we did have to recreate so many costumes. We had one tailor who did all the dresses.
And all the extras.
And all the extras. She had a couple of seamstresses working with her. But
and the extras came at 3:30 in the morning for their hair and makeup call that day. Like, it was amazing dedication. Everybody who made this episode really showed up in such a labor of love. But
yeah, we had room at least as big as this, sectioned off with hair and makeup stations and costume stations, and and the lines went on forever, and you didn't think we'd ever get them all dressed. But with Jessica, we studied the research quite a bit, and we watched how the dress moved and all the, luckily there's a lot of research, and it was well documented. However, a lot of it was in black and white, so we had to really figure out the tones. So we would get the fabrics, and then we would shoot it in black and white so we could see, oh, I think it needs to be more blue or more gray or more green. And then we searched for fabrics. We couldn't find a fabric that moved the way that it moved in the video. So we finally found some fabric similar in New York, and then they shipped it, and we had to carefully over-dye the whole thing in a bathtub. And then it came out pretty good, and then we had to or our tailor had to hand sew tons of beads up on the top to fill it all up and give it that movement. And we copied the necklace and the earrings to the exact replica of the real one. And then, let's see, the gloves, the silver fox, she wore chinchilla. And so we went down to every detail. We must have watched those clips 100 times to get every detail right.